life, new life, rebirth in him. Today I want to talk about the resurrection for obvious reasons, because it is Easter. And according to the most recent statistics that I was able to find, about 80% of Americans are celebrating Easter, at least in some form today. I believe about 51% of Americans are planning or are currently going to church today on Easter Sunday. And so it's a very fitting day for us to talk about this because, well, everybody else is. And it is a glorious, glorious time that although we celebrate the resurrection of Jesus in all of our lives, every Lord's Day, every Monday through Saturday, and hopefully 365 days of every single year of our lives that we can breathe on this planet, this is a day that we pay particular attention to the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And yet, even with all that being said, the resurrection is a controversial subject. And I would even say that it's not just controversial, but it is, I think you could make the argument, the most consequential of all of our beliefs. Now, there are many religions and many mythologies out there, and there are many traditions, and they have a lot of things in common. Morality and storytelling and wisdom and even a basic belief in God or some higher power. But of all the things that our faith may have in common with other faiths out there, there is something above all else that separates it, that makes it unique, that makes it the one true path to God. And that is the resurrection. That the Son of God, deity dwelling in bodily form, according to Colossians 2, could empty himself, like Philippians 2 says, and to come in the form of a slave, a bondservant, to give his life as a ransom for many, that by his wounds we can be healed, and by his resurrection we can share in the hope of our own resurrection from the dead. That because he defeated death, which is the last enemy, in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, that we too can share in his victory over death. And yet this message has always been a bit of a cleaver between the gospel and other beliefs. Though it is hope for all mankind, not all of mankind has embraced this hope. Because the resurrection, again, of all the things that we believe, the resurrection above everything else is this uncompromising, unflinching, inconvenient wedge that refuses to let anybody remain ambivalent or on the sideline or non-committal. He was either raised or he wasn't. You're either going to be raised or you won't be. Jesus is either real and alive and glorified, or you don't need to believe anything at all about him because it doesn't matter. There is no middle ground when it comes to the resurrection. There is no middle ground on who Jesus is and was and continues to be glorified at the right hand of the Father. There is no middle ground on that. And so what we believe about the resurrection is of utmost importance. Controversial, you say? Well, a lot of people believe in the resurrection. Again, if you look at the statistics, and I know, statistics aren't always going to tell the exact truth about something, and, depending on how broadly you may take those statistics, but the majority of Americans actually do believe that the resurrection was a historical fact. Now, it's not much of a majority, but still, the majority of Americans, if you asked them, do you believe Jesus actually was raised from the dead? They go, yeah, sure, I guess it's a historical fact. Yeah. The issue is, what are the implications of that? You may accept something, you may even accept something pretty fantastic as a historical fact. But how has that impacted you? How has that changed you? What does that do to you in terms of where are you going to go with that? Listen, many are willing to accept the Bible up to a point. Many are willing to accept Jesus up to a point. They'll say Jesus was a good man. Jesus was a humanitarian. Jesus taught us about love and to practice charity. They'll say the Bible has inspiring stories and timeless wisdom. They'll say, yeah, Christianity helps to provide us with treasured traditions and its morals undergird our society. But taking Jesus and his resurrection as literal, historical, actual, there is no dead body in the tomb fact, well, the implications of that are shocking. And it amazes me that people try so hard and work so hard to remain non-committal when it comes to what the resurrection of Jesus actually means for us. Now, his teaching on the subject was controversial even when he was alive. When Jesus talked about his own resurrection, as vague as it might have seemed to a lot of people, it was usually met with negative response. Even from his own disciples, the subject of his death, burial, and resurrection, like we read about in Matthew chapter 16 and verse 22, was met with consternation. When his own disciples heard of it, they'd go, no. Jesus, I think you've got your story a little bit mixed up. Surely that's not going to happen. It was met with distress by other people. It confused people. They became discouraged in Matthew chapter 17 when Jesus again mentions that he's going to die and to be raised up again. They're met with distress. It saddened them to hear about this. His enemies would totally misapply some of the things that he said about resurrection. Jesus said, "Tear this temple down and I will rebuild it in 3 days." Now, you can understand maybe why they misunderstood that. And it was only in hindsight, 2020, of course, that they were able to look back and say, oh, he wasn't talking about rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem. It was his body. He would die and be raised up in 3 days. But they totally misapplied it. And it was that statement that they used in his trial against him. Other people just said that his talk of resurrection was just pure insanity. That's what they said in John chapter 10. This guy's crazy, or he's got a demon. What are you talking about? And so, yeah, the subject of the resurrection was controversial. To outsiders, to those in Judaism, they regarded it as a hotly debated subject. Gentiles, in Acts chapter 17, when Paul was preaching in Athens, he gets to the point about the resurrection, and a lot of them go, I don't know. I was with you up to the point you started talking about resurrection, and then you lost me after that. Uh-oh. There we go. And of course, the fact that it was such a sticking point actually lends credibility to the entire story of the resurrection. It seems hardly likely that a late rabbi's disciples would insist on such a fantastic element to his life story if indeed it was a total fabrication. In fact, rather than avoiding it or burying it or sweeping it under the rug, the disciples of Jesus make it the front and center, like the first thing you're going to learn about Jesus when you ask them about their faith. The resurrection of Jesus is like the front door of faith. And they did not hide from it. They were not embarrassed by it. For time's sake, we don't have the time to look at all these examples, but just look at these examples, and there are more of them than what's on the screen. But in the book of Acts, over and over and over again, the disciples talk about the resurrection as a historical fact and as the centerpiece of their faith. They don't act like, we love Jesus, he's the Son of God, and he was also killed on a cross. They weren't embarrassed by it. When they said he was raised from the dead, they weren't like, this is the really hard part to believe, but he was raised from the dead. No, again, this is like the front door of faith. They showed it. They put it on a pedestal. They talked about it. They were anything but embarrassed. Far from being embarrassed, they were willing to suffer because of the resurrection. That's what Paul said in 2 Timothy 2, verses 8 and 9, that because of the resurrection and the hope of the resurrection, he's willing to suffer all these things. They were willing to die for the resurrection. In Acts chapter 7, after Stephen says this whole thing in the chapter, he makes his audience so mad that they begin to pick up stones to stone him to death. And what are the last things that Stephen talks about? He says, I see Jesus right now at the right hand of the Father. And their teeth gritting, their blood pressure rising, they begin to kill him with stones, and he speaks to the risen, glorified Christ, forgive them. They don't understand what they're doing. He was willing to go to his death, witnessing to the resurrection of Jesus. Paul calls it of first importance in 1 Corinthians 15, an essential part of the gospel message. It's presented as the demonstration of God's great gift of love toward us in Ephesians chapter 1. It's the basis for our justification in Romans chapter 4 and verse 25. It's the basis for our salvation in Romans chapter 10 and verse 9. That what are we confessing when we confess Jesus Christ as Lord? We confess that he was raised from the dead. We're saved because of that confession. Now, Tim already alluded to this subject in his Lord's Supper talk a little while ago. And so I'll keep this brief. And this is not the main body of this lesson anyway. It's actually my third point that is the one I really want to focus on. So I'll go through this pretty quickly here. But you may ask, with all this controversy, given the questions swirling around Jesus, given that it was 2,000 years ago, given that we don't know where exactly in ancient Jerusalem this tomb is, like you can't stand at a spot and go, this is where Mary Magdalene was standing when she saw the risen Lord. Given all these things, you may wonder, is it even plausible anymore to believe in the resurrection as a historical fact? Well, there are many strong lines of evidence in favor of the resurrection, such as, and I'm going to give all these to you basically as bullet points, and I'm going to recommend some resources to you before we move on to the last point of the lesson. But there's the credibility of numerous independent witnesses. When you have a story being told by multiple witnesses, and every element of that story lends itself to credibility, that every part of that story seems credible. And it's not fantastic, it's not ridiculous, it's not contradictory. The witness testimony has to count for a lot. Mark's gospel, like Tim said, was probably the first gospel that was put to paper, but it itself was based on very early witness testimony, probably within a few years of the resurrection itself. Matthew and John were eyewitnesses themselves of the risen Christ. So it doesn't matter when they wrote it, whether it was 30 or 40 years later. Is eyewitness testimony any less valid when somebody finally puts it on paper 30 or 40 years later? When someone finally says, hey, you've been talking about your witness testimony for 40 years now. You've been preaching your witness testimony. You've been consistent in your witness testimony. Well, how about for future generations, put it on paper so that people 2,000 years from now can also have access to your eyewitness testimony. And Matthew and John, again, both eyewitnesses to Jesus raised from the dead, inspired by the Holy Spirit as they were, did that very thing. Luke claims to have thoroughly researched the facts of the matter many years later, and yet even Luke's well-researched understanding of the resurrection lines up with what Matthew and John saw and what Mark based his account on and the witnesses that he talked to. There's the fact that the accounts of the resurrection in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John don't have any of the fantastical embellishments that later apocryphal books did, like the Gospel of Peter. At least a century later, there's a so-called Gospel of Peter that has at the resurrection scene a gigantic cross coming up out of the tomb, and this literal giant cross begins preaching to everybody about Jesus. You don't have that sort of thing in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They read like real things that happen. not myths and legends with a bunch of embellishment. There's the willingness of the disciples to not only suffer, but to die for the resurrection. And again, I'm stepping on what Tim said, and so I don't want to spend a lot of time repeating that. But the fact that somebody's willing to die, if this is all a fabrication, if this is all just a lie, listen, you got 11 disciples, excluding Judas now. You got 11 disciples. I would get it if a few of them were willing to buy into the story so much that to their very deaths they would be willing to say Jesus was raised from the dead. But all of them? And then you've got the women who are witnesses. You've got Mary, the mother of Jesus, whose life actually had to be protected. You have the hundreds of others who were witnesses, as Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 15. And you're telling me that of all of these people, that this was a fabrication and a lie, not a single one of them under possible death finally cracked and said, all right, you got me. Boy, we were really playing chicken with this whole thing. We were bluffing the whole time. We made up the story. We stole the body. Please don't kill me now. You mean not a single one of them? A friend of mine actually pointed something out this very morning, and I took a screenshot of it because I really liked the quote. But he posted something on Facebook about those who were involved in the Watergate scandal. And there were 12 of them, actually, who were involved in the Watergate scandal. And let me read you something here real quick. This is a quote from a friend of mine. Chuck Colson knew something about cover-ups from the inside. As Richard Nixon's special counsel, he was one of the most powerful political operatives in the country. He later admitted that he would have done nearly anything to protect the president. But when Watergate unraveled, he watched it happen in real time. 12 men, highly motivated, politically sophisticated, with every reason to hold the line, but they couldn't do it. And the cover-up collapsed in weeks. 12 men couldn't keep their lies straight to protect Richard Nixon. Are you honestly trying to tell me that the hundreds of people who saw Jesus raised from the dead, that not a single one of them wouldn't have cracked at some point under penalty of death and torture if the whole thing's made up? The fact that the earliest arguments from the Jewish authorities, like is pointed out in Matthew chapter 28, the fact that the argument from them is, well, why don't we let's pay some people off to say that they stole the body. Yeah, they stole the body. You know what's implied in all of that? They acknowledged the tomb was empty. They weren't paying people to say the tomb was still sealed, because they acknowledged the tomb was empty. So the only story they could put out there is that the body was stolen. And finally, the first witnesses of the empty tomb and the resurrected Jesus were all women. And now that might be a fact from our perspective in the 21st century that could easily go unnoticed. But in both Roman and Jewish law, the testimony of women was not admissible in court. They lived in a very different culture, in a very different legal system. So here's what I'm saying about this. If you were going to make up a story about Jesus being raised from the dead and you wanted it to be airtight, I mean, lock-tight, solid, okay, guys, we gotta get all our facts straight. Jesus was raised from the dead, sure. Who are we going to put out there as witnesses? And someone raises his hand and says, I know what we should do. We should have all the women say. And they all look at him going, women? You mean you want us to put out there that the first people who saw him raised from the dead were women? Their word isn't even admitted in court. Their witness is not valid legally. If you were going to make up the story of the resurrection, the last witness testimony that you want to put out there, front and center, is the witness of a bunch of women. Now, I'm not saying that's my commentary, your commentary. I'm not saying that's our perspective on women's witness testimony. But the fact that they lived under a legal system that did not even acknowledge the validity of women's witness testimony actually adds a ton of credibility to the story of the resurrection. Because if you were making it up, you would have scrubbed that little detail because you want this thing to be airtight. But no, the fact is that it was the women who saw Jesus raised from the dead first. And it was the men back at home who were the ones struggling hardest to reconcile with that. A few other resources just for you to consider, just some books if you want to take a screenshot of that or something like that. These are some of the books that I would recommend. I mean, I don't wholesale recommend everything that they say or other things that these writers have written, but I find that these are really, really good resources. If you want to know about the historicity and the credibility and the legal implications of the testimony of Jesus being raised from the dead, these are really, really good resources. All right, but let's get to this last point here, because this is where the rubber meets the road. We could just end right here, and I'll say, for the sake of time, we're going to end the last part of this lesson, okay? But we need to know why this matters. Why does it matter that Jesus was raised from the dead? Why does it matter that it is a true and historical fact? Why does it matter that the Son of God came in the flesh, that his flesh was ripped and torn and killed and buried and then reanimated and came forth from the grave? Why does it matter? Well, as I said, 80% of people are going to be celebrating Easter today, but that doesn't mean that 80% of people are being impacted by the message of the resurrection. Listen, traditions are comforting. We all like candy. Stories can be very riveting. Holidays are fun. We love getting together with family and having big family feasts, except, of course, for the family that has to be the host. But the Son of God dying brutally, buried in a tomb and raised up, friends, that has to matter more than all of the traditions around Easter. It has to matter to us that Jesus was raised from the dead. It speaks to the great power that God has over life and death and your life and death. It speaks to his authority. It speaks to our obedience to him. It speaks to our hope of the resurrection, which is prefigured in baptism in Romans chapter 6. It speaks to the ultimate victory of Jesus, who is superior to all of the promises of Eastern religions, of reincarnation, of New Age cults, of gurus. For it is God alone who gives life. It is God alone who will give it back to you on the last day when you will be judged. Because it is Jesus alone who has defeated death, the last enemy. And when Jesus returns, like Colossians chapter 3 points out, and we see him in his glory, we're going to be glorified as well if we have put our hope in him. If then, Colossians 3 verse 1, if then you have been raised up with Christ, then keep seeking the things above where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on the things above, not on things of the earth, for you have died and your life is hidden with Christ in God. And when Christ, who is our life, is revealed, then you also will be revealed with him in glory. But there's one more thing. And if you're tired of hearing me preach, you're probably thinking, you've said there's one more thing several times now. But it's like turning the knob on a little microscope, go a little closer and a little closer and a little closer. And now we're getting really close to home here. Because this is what the resurrection means to me. It changes everything for me. And it's supposed to change everything for you too. Someone very wise, who would be embarrassed if I mentioned her name, but Jamie said in a presentation last week that culture is shaping the next generation's understanding of faith far more than faith is shaping our understanding of culture. Think about that. Who's being influenced by who? Are you really making a difference with culture? Or is culture like a tide crashing against you, whittling away at your faith, eroding your conviction? the world sits in bold-faced opposition to everything that the gospel proclaims and everything that the gospel offers to us. And so the resurrection of Jesus stands as the definitive, uncompromising cleaver between two different paths: the path of the flesh or the path of the Spirit. Which path are you going to take? The world says, clout or influence is more important than humble service. Do our kids know that? Do our kids hear that? Who's looking at me right now? Is he looking? Is she looking? How many likes is it? How many shares is it? If I can be influential, if I can be seen, if I can be somebody, well, that's a lot more important than being a servant to other people, serving in the background with no credit and no glory. And yet that is what the resurrection points to. It changes our mentality on that. That it was for humble service that Jesus came and died the way that he did. The world says money is the answer to everything. And I think Solomon in Ecclesiastes 10 verse 19 kind of sarcastically points that out. People drink to be merry and they eat food to get full, and money's the answer to everything. And I don't think he really means that. I think he's being sarcastic. But that's the world's answer, isn't it? Money is the answer to everything. And yet the gospel comes in and says, shame on you for even thinking that. Because there's treasures here on earth that you're wasting your time filling your life with. And there's treasures in heaven that you have not taken a single moment to take into account. Well, the world says educated people don't waste their time with God. Religion is for the ignorant. And yet Proverbs chapter 9 says that the fear of the Lord is the very beginning of wisdom. And if you don't fear God, you have not even laid a foundation for being a wise person. The world says have as much fun as you can before you're rotting in the grave, because you get one life to live, so you might as well live it to its fullest. Grab a Mountain Dew and hit the slopes, friends. And yet the gospel says you don't have one life. Now you have one life to make the right choice. You have one life to set the right priorities. You have one life to follow the path of the Spirit. But there is going to be a resurrection of both the evil and the good. And one will go away to a resurrection of life. The other will go away to a resurrection of eternal judgment. So don't eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you die. No, set your life in order with God, for tomorrow you may die. And there will be a judgment after that. And I guess I'm speaking in particular to our young people, and I hope our young people will pay attention that if I lost you at any point in this sermon, I want you to fixate upon one passage in particular. Please, teenagers, preteens, college students, please. This is the difference that the resurrection makes. You can spend your whole life looking for the flesh and living for the flesh and loving the flesh, and the world would love it if you joined them in that pursuit. Or you can take a look at the empty tomb and make the calculation. Why did he do it? What do I need to do in response? For those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh. But those who are in accord with the Spirit, the things of the Spirit. For the mind set on the flesh is death, but the mind set on the Spirit is life and peace. However, you are not in the flesh, but in the Spirit, if indeed the Spirit of God dwells in you. But if anyone does not have the Spirit of Christ, he doesn't belong to him. If Christ is in you, though the body is dead because of sin, yet the Spirit is alive because of righteousness. Verse 11. But if the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you, then he who raised Christ Jesus from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies through his Spirit who dwells in you. So then, brothers and sisters, we are under obligation, not to the flesh, to live according to the flesh. And I'll pause and make a comment. You don't owe the flesh anything. You don't owe worldly friends anything. You don't owe Satan anything. You don't owe anything in this world more than what you owe God. We are not under obligation to the flesh, for flesh is dying. We are under obligation to the Spirit. For if you live according to the flesh, you're going to die. But if by the Spirit you're putting to death the deeds of the body, then you will live. And so I say, will you live today? You have come to be among us on this Easter Sunday, and I'm so thankful that you're here. What a wonderful thing to be with you. What a wonderful thing to be together as Christians, as believers, as people who proclaim the life, death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. But if you're not right with God, don't leave here today saying, I'll just see you next year, and think that everything's okay. Because if you leave here and you just go walk according to the flesh, listen to Romans 8. There is an outcome to that life, and it is not good. So will you listen to the gospel message today? If you have anything at all that we can help you with today of a spiritual nature, we're here and we would love to assist you, encourage you, pray for you, teach you, walk you through those steps. If you need anything at all, then please let that need be known by coming forward as we stand and sing together.